Lecture number 2, delivered by Friedrich Nietzsche, February 6th, 1872. Honored listeners, those of you joining me today, having heard perhaps only rumors of the lecture I gave 3 weeks ago, must now permit me to bring you, without further ado, into the middle of a serious conversation in progress. I started to retell that conversation in my first lecture, and I will now remind you all of the last turn it had taken. An important philosopher's young companion had just explained to his teacher in honest and forthright fashion why he had become demoralized, left his teaching post, and was spending his days in inconsolable, self-imposed solitude. Arrogance had not played a part of his decision. I have heard too much from you, teacher, and spent too much time in your presence, the worthy young man said, to have faith in our current pedagogical and cultural regime. I feel all too clearly its hopeless errors and defects, which you have so often pointed out. And yet I see in myself all too little of the strength I would need to prevail in a valiant struggle to shatter the bulwarks of this supposed education. My flight into solitude was not arrogance or presumption. I felt totally discouraged. He then explained his actions by giving his view of the educational system in such a way that the philosopher could not help but respond in a sympathetic, reassuring tone. You have said enough, my poor friend, he said. I understand you better now, and I should have not spoken such hard words to you before. You are right about everything, except your discouragement. Let me now tell you something that will give you solace. How long do you think today's schools will persist in educational practices that weigh so heavily upon you? I make no secret what I think. Their time is past. Their days are numbered. The first man who dares to be completely honest about them will hear this honesty echoing back from 1,000 other brave souls. For buried in the men of the present age, beneath all their noble gifts and warm sentiments, is an unspoken common cause. Every one of them remembers what he has had to suffer in school. Every one of them wants, if nothing else, to save his descendants from such a system, even at some risk to himself. But due to the sad poverty of spirit in pedagogy today, this longing is never voiced openly. There is no true creative talent here, which is to say, truly practical men with good new ideas, who know that real genius and correct practice necessarily go together. Our plodding practitioners have no good ideas, thus no correct practice either. Just read around in today's pedagogical literature. Anyone not utterly horrified to see it clumsily chase its own tail with an incalculable poverty of spirit is beyond help. Here our philosophy must begin not with wonder, but with horror. And no one incapable of a feeling of such should touch pedagogical matters. The reverse has been the rule up until today, of course. Those who are horrified, like you, my poor friend, ran skittishly away, while the reasonable types, not susceptible to horror, laid their coarse hands coarsely upon the most delicate process in any art, the process of education. But soon this state of affairs will no longer be possible. Let just one honest man turn up with a good new idea and the courage to bring this idea to fruition, even if the cost of breaking with everyone and everything around him. Let him present such one glorious example, which coarse hands, the only ones hitherto at work, could never imitate. Then people will begin to see and feel the difference, at least, and have a chance to reflect on the reason for it. They will no longer believe, as so many in good conscience still do, that the craft of pedagogy can be the labor of coarse hands. His companion replied, "Honored teacher, you give voice so courageously to your hopes. Give me an example, just one, if you can, to help me share them. The gymnasium, for instance, which we both know well. Do you actually think that honestly and good new ideas can eradicate the stubborn old habits there? It seems to me that the gymnasium defends itself, not with a hard wall strong enough to withstand the battering ram, as it were, but with the deadly, slippery tenacity of all its principles. There is no tangible, visible opponent to crush, only a masked enemy, able to take on 1,000 shapes and slip free, giving way like a coward, and then suddenly bouncing back to confound his attackers again and again. It was the state of the gymnasium, in particular, that made me flee into demoralized solitude, because I felt that if you could win that battle, all the other educational institutions would have to follow suit. But if you lost, there would be no chance but to give up on all the most serious pedagogical questions. So, master, instruct me. What hope can we cherish for the gymnasium's destruction and of its rebirth? I, too, feel the gymnasium is an important thing, just as you, the philosopher replied. Every other institution is measured against its educational goals. Any wrong turn the gymnasium takes will affect all the others. Renewing and purifying it will renew and purify the rest. Even the university can no longer claim such central, decisive importance. From at least one important angle, which I will clarify later, the university in its current form must be seen as merely an extension of the gymnasium. For now, let us consider why I am hopeful that one of two things must happen. Either the spirit of the gymnasium, as it has come down to us, motley and difficult to pin down as it is, will dissolve on its own into thin air, or else it will have to be purified and renewed from the ground up. So as not to overwhelm you by generalities, let me begin concretely with something we have all experienced in the gymnasium and still suffer from, scrutinized with a rigorous eye. What is German class at the gymnasium today? First, let me say what it should be. Everyone nowadays automatically speaks and writes in a German so vulgar and bad that it can only exist in the age of newspaper German. That is why any nobly endowed young man should be forcibly placed under a bell jar of good taste and strict linguistic discipline. If that is not possible, then better to return to speaking only Latin out of the shame of a language as ruined and debased as our own. What should the task of an institution of higher learning be when it comes to language, if not to lead linguistically wild and unkempt youth to the right path with dignified rigor and this authoritative command. Take your language seriously. If you cannot feed a sacred duty here, then you have not even the seed of higher culture within you. How you handle your mother tongue reveals how you respect art, either how much or how little, how close an affinity you have for it. If certain words and turns of phrase, habitual in today's journalism, do not inspire physical disgust, then abandon your pursuit of culture. Here, right before you, every time you speak and write, you have a touchstone for how difficult and enormous a task the cultured person faces today, and how unlikely it is that many of you will become truly educated. Were this the gymnasium's command, the German teacher's duty would be to point out with the complete assurance of a good ear 1,000 little details to his students and to categorically forbid them from using phrases such as to call for, to pocket, take into account, seize the initiative. It goes without saying, and so on and so forth, cum tedio in infinitum. This teacher would also have to show line by line how carefully and vigorously we would have to take every turn of phrase in our classic writers if we kept a true feeling for art in our hearts and the goal of complete intelligibility in our sights. He would force his students to express the same thought over and over again, a little bit better each time, and will stop at nothing until he has inspired in the less gifted students a pious awe for the language, and in the more gifted a noble enthusiasm. Such is the task of so-called formal education, one of the most valuable tasks of all. But now, what do we find at the site of this so-called formal education, the gymnasium of today? Any true judge of what goes on there will know what to make of these alleged educational institutions, originally designed not to foster education and culture, but to promote mere erudition. They have recently turned their back on even that, and now I am at journalism. Nowhere is this more evident than in the teaching of German. Instead of providing purely practical institutions, instead of providing mere purely practical instruction and accustoming the student to rigorous self-improvement through a strict cultivation of language, teachers everywhere take a scholarly historical approach to the mother tongue. They teach German like a dead language, with no sense of obligation toward its present and its future. This historicism has become so prevalent in our time that even the living body of our language is handed over for anatomical dissection. But education begins precisely when we understand that a living thing is alive. The task of the educator is precisely to suppress the historical interest that presses on all sides, especially where it is a question of proper action, not merely understanding something. Students need to learn how to use the mother tongue properly, and this practical perspective is the only justification for teaching German in our educational institutions. The historical approach seems much easier and more comfortable to the teacher. Of course, it is appropriate even for the less talented and demands much less effort and will. And what is easy and comfortable always cloaks itself in proud terminology and ostentatious pretension. We see this in every pedagogical field. The practical approach appropriate to true education, the approach that actually works is always fundamentally more difficult, and thus earns only looks of resentment and disdain. That this is why the honest man has to make this quid pro quo clear, both to himself and to others. What motivation for studying the German language does the teacher typically offer besides these scholarly considerations? What link does he forge between the spirit of his educational institution and the spirit of the few truly educated members of the German people, the classic poets and artists? This is a dark and dubious domain, and one must be brave, indeed, to shine a light into it. But we cannot refuse to look. Someday, everything here too will have to be made new. In today's gymnasiums, the still unformed spirit of the students are stamped with the sickening features of our aesthetic journalism. The teacher himself sows the seeds of cruel misunderstandings of our classic writers. A desire to misunderstand that will later bloom into what pretends to be aesthetic criticism, but is actually nothing but insolent barbarism. Students learn to speak of our incomparable Schiller with schoolboyish superiority. They are taught to respond to his noblest and most German concepts, the Marquis of Posa in Don Carlos, Max and Thekla in Wallenstein, with a supercilious smile that is an outrage to the German spirit, and which is a better posterity, and which a better posterity will blush to recall. The third and last domain of a typical gymnasium, German teacher, often considered the pinnacle of his activity, and sometimes even the pinnacle of gymnasium education altogether, is the so-called German essay. It is almost always the most gifted students who tackle the assignment with special pleasure. And that alone should make it clear how tempting and dangerous a task it presents. The essay appeals to the student's individuality. The more aware a student is of his distinguishing characters and qualities, the more he gives his German essay a personal stamp. Most gymnasiums even require this personal stamp through the choice of topics offered to students. And for me, the strongest proof of this fact is that the students in earlier grades are asked to create and describe their own life and development. An inherently unpedagogical topic. One need only peruse the lists of German essays and their topics across several gymnasiums to be convinced that the vast majority of students will probably, through no fault of their own necessarily, suffer for life from this work of individuality demanded too soon. This breeding of immature thought in their minds. How often a whole literary career can seem like nothing more than the sad consequence of this pedagogical original sin against the spirit. Consider what happens when someone produces such an essay at that age. It is the first thing he writes on his own. His still undeveloped powers coalesce and crystallize for the first time. The dizzying feeling of having been asked to be independent gives the result a magical halo of newness, destined never to return. All his natural audacity is called forth from the depths. All his vanity unchecked by stronger barrier is for the first time permitted to take literary form. From that point onward, the young person feels himself to be finished. He feels himself to be finished indeed, encouraged to speak with anyone on equal terms. The topics assigned to him force him, in fact, to cast his vote on works of poetry, or lump together historical figures in a character sketch, or tackle serious ethical problems independently, or even turn the spotlight upon himself and portray his own development, delivering a critical report of his own unique self. In short, a whole world of deeply intellectual and self-reflective tasks is presented to a surprised young man who has had practically no self-awareness up until that very point and had a matter of his own judgment. Now think back to how teachers typically respond to these original efforts, which do so much to shape the young student. What does the teacher seem worthy of criticism? What does he draw his students' attention to? Any extravagance of form or thought, which is to say precisely what is typical of that age and particular to him. Any true independence the student may have, necessarily expressed in awkward, exaggerated, or somewhat of a grotesque form when provoked so prematurely, but still, this is the student's individuality. Thus the teacher reprimands and rejects in favor of what is unoriginal, conformist, and respectable. Lockstep mediocrity receives tired, grudging praise because the teacher finds himself bored by it, and with good reason. Perhaps there are others who see these essay assignments as the farce that they truly are. Not only the most absurd feature of the gymnasium today, but also the most dangerous. The essays demand originality, but the only originality possible at that age is then rejected. They presume a formal education that only very few people will ever acquire, even in riper years. They treat every student as being capable of literature, as allowed to have opinions about the most serious people and things, whereas true education will actually strive with all its might precisely to suppress this ridiculous claim to independence of judgment on the part of the young person, imposing instead strict obedience to the scepter of genius. They ask writers to present ideas in a larger framework at an age when their every last written or spoken sentence is a barbaric abomination. And let us not forget how easy it is to awaken smug self-satisfaction during those years. Think of the vanity of the young man seeing his literary reflection in the mirror for the first time. Given all this, who could possibly doubt that the exercise stamps each rising generation with everything that ails our literary and artistic public sphere? The hasty overproduction, driven by self-regard, the shameful churning out of books, the complete lack of style, immature formulations that miserably sprawl or lack character altogether, the loss of any aesthetic canon, the reveling in anarchy and chaos, in short, the literary traits of our journalism and no less our scholars. Few people nowadays realize that 1 in 1,000 at most is justified in putting his writing before the world. Everyone else who even strives to attempt to put their writing before the world at his own risk, earns as the just reward for every sentence he sees into print nothing but Homeric laughs from readers capable of true judgment. For truly it is a spectacle for the gods, watching a literary Hephaestus limp with his pathetic offerings. To inculcate serious and unrelenting critical habits and opinions is one of the highest tasks of formal education. The ubiquitous encouragement of everyone's so-called individual personality is nothing but the mark of barbarity. But surely it is clear from what I have said thus far that German classes today are designed to foster individual personality, not to educate. And as long as gymnasiums continue to promote despicable, unconscionable scribbling by assigning German essays, as long as they refuse to take as their sacred duty the imposition of practical discipline on what is close to hand, the spoken and written language, as long as they treat their mother tongue as nothing but a necessary evil or a dead body, I cannot consider them educational institutions in any sense of the word. Above all, gymnasium language instruction shows no sign of being influenced by the classical model. This alone, to my knowledge, makes it dubious and misleading to claim that a gymnasium provide a so-called classical education. The tremendous seriousness with which the Greeks and the Romans considered and handled their language from youth on is clear at a glance. This is what the classical Greek and Roman world is a model for. How could anyone fail to see it? Even if that world is held up as the highest and most instructive model for the gymnasium's educational program in other ways, although I, for one, have many of my doubts about that too. The gymnasium's claim to sow the seeds of classical education is really nothing but an embarrassed excuse, trotted out whenever anyone disputes its ability to instill culture. Classical education. Oh, that sounds so distinguished. It shames the attacker and it slows down the attack, for it takes time to get to the bottom of any phrase so distracting and disorienting. This is the gymnasium's habitual tactic. Depending on where the battle cry rings out from, it writes on its own shield, not exactly covered with badges of honor, one of these three confusing slogans. It either says classical education, formal education, or simply academic training. Three glorious things, but unfortunately they are partly self-contradictory, partly contradicting each other. Violently yoking all three together can only produce some mythical educational tragalophos, half stag, half goat. A classical education, truly classical education, is something so egregiously rare and difficult, demanding such a complex array of talents, that only the most naive or shameless would hold it out as a goal that the gymnasium can even achieve. The term formal education is a piece of crude, unphilosophical phraseology that one must simply try to free oneself from, since there is no such thing as a material education, standing in contrast to it. Finally, anyone who holds up academic training as the goal of the gymnasium abandons then and there any classical education or so-called formal education. Indeed, abandons the gymnasium's whole educational mission, since the academic and the true educated man of culture belong to two different spheres, which may occasionally overlap in a particular individual, but which never coincide. When we compare these three stated goals of the gymnasium with what we actually observe in German class, we can see that they primarily are in practice. Embarrassed pretexts, evasive maneuvers for use in battle and war, which often work to bewilder the enemy. There is nothing in German institution the least bit reminiscent of the grand ancient language training we call classical. German essays, as I've said before, provide a formal education that turns out to be the absolutely arbitrary whim of individual personality, or in other words, anarchy and barbarism. And as for the academic training that it supposes to result from this institution, let our German professors impartially judge how little the lifeblood of their discipline owes to these early scholarly efforts in the gymnasium, and how much it owes to the individual personalities of particular university instructors. In sum, the gymnasium has neglected and still neglects the one place where true education begins, and the readiest subject to hand, the mother tongue. The mother tongue. As a result, the natural, fertile soil for any future educational process is missing. Only rigorously disciplined, artistically scrupulous linguistic standards can create a proper feeling for the greatness of our classical writers. But up to now, gymnasiums have praised these classical writers only on the basis of their content of certain tragedies and novels, or various individual teachers' dubious athletic hobby horses. And yet, one must know from personal experience how difficult language is. After searching long and struggling hard, one must reach on one's own the path our great poet strided, or have strode. If one is to feel how lightly and gracefully they walk it, and how swiftly and awkwardly others follow in their footsteps. After being subjected to such discipline, and only then the young person will feel physical disgust for the refined dictation of our literati and the elegance of style, so beloved and praised in our novelists and mass producers of journalism. He will be raised in a single stroke, once and for all, above a whole range of truly comical debates and scruples. For instance, whether Auerbach and Gutskov are great writers. He will simply be too disgusted to read them at all. Problem solved. Let no one think it is easy to develop one's sensitivity to the point of physical nausea, but let no one hope that it is possible to acquire an aesthetic sense along any other path except the thorny one of language, and by that I mean linguistic self-discipline, not linguistics. To make a serious effort here is to undergo an ordeal like that of a grown man becoming. Say a new soldier who has to learn how to walk after having been merely a crude dilettante or empiricist of walking. There are laborious months These are laborious months. He is afraid he will tear a tendon. He loses all hope of ever being able to perform these artificial, conscious, learned movements, and place his feet easily and comfortably again. He is shocked. He's shocked to see how awkwardly and crudely he actually puts one foot in front of the other. He worries he will entirely unlearn how to walk without ever learning to do it properly. But suddenly he realizes that these artificially drilled movements have turned into a habit, become a second nature. All the certainty and power of his stride are returned to him, stronger than before, and even with a certain grace. Now he too knows how hard it is to walk, and he has earned the right to mock the crude empiricists of walking, the dilettantes of walking, and their pretense to elegance. Our elegant writers have never learned to walk. Their style proves it. Our gymnasiums do not teach this skill either. Our writers prove it, but a proper linguistic gait is the beginning of culture, and if begun correctly, it eventually produces a physical sensitivity to elegant writers that we call nausea. We see here the fateful consequences of our gymnasium system. Gymnasiums cannot impart a true rigorous education, which is above all obedience and habituation. At best, they can only encourage and stimulate scholarly impulses. This explains the alliance we so often find between erudition and barbaric taste, between the academic and the newspaper. Scholars today, with a shocking lack of exceptions, have fallen away from, or shall I say sunk beneath, the educational heights that, thanks to the efforts of Goethe, Schiller, Lessing, and Winckelmann, the German system once reached. We see this falling away in the gross misunderstandings to which these great men are subjected by literary historians, whether named Gervinus or Schmidt, as much as by others in practically any conversation, in fact, with educated men and women. The clearest evidence of this decline, though, as well as the most painful, is the current state of pedagogical writing about the gymnasium. For half a century or more, this body of writing has not even mentioned, much less recognized, the only value such great men have for true educational institutions. Their value as leaders and guides, path-breaking mystagogues of classical education, with whom alone can be found the true path back to classical antiquity. There is only one natural, healthy starting point for this so-called classical education: artistically serious, rigorous training in the use of the mother tongue. Almost no one finds his path and the secret of form alone from within. Everyone else needs great leaders and teachers and must trust their protection. But unless this sense of form is fully developed, there is no way for any classical education or culture to grow. The awakening of this sensibility, able to distinguish between form and abomination, is the first flutter of the wing that can carry us to the only true homeland of culture, Greek antiquity. That wing alone cannot bear us very far, of course, as we attempt to reach the infinite distant stronghold of Hellenic culture, ringed around with its animatine ramparts. We need these leaders, These teachers are classic German writers if we are to be borne aloft under the ring beats and their quest for antiquity to the land of deepest longings, Greece. Barely a whisper of this, the only possible relation between our classic writers and classical education, has penetrated the antiquarian walls of the gymnasium, needless to say. Rather, our philologists indefatigably try to bring Homer and Sophocles to young souls unaided, and they call the result classical education, a euphemism no one objects to. Let us each look to our own personal experience and judge how much of Homer and Sophocles these tireless teachers have given us. We are here in the realm of the most prevalent, yet most powerful delusions of unintentionally spread misunderstandings. I have never once found in German gymnasium a single gossamer thread of any that can truly be called classical education. And no wonder, given how the gymnasium has freed itself from the classical German, from the German classics, and any German linguistic discipline. Classical antiquity cannot be reached by a blind leap into the void. And yet the whole treatment of ancient writers in our schools, all the righteous paraphrasing and commentating of our philological schoolmasters is just such a leap into the void. A feeling for classical Hellenic culture is so rare, a result of artistic gifts together with the most strenuous educational struggle, that the gymnasium's claim to awaken it can only rest on a brutal misunderstanding. And awaken it in the people of what age? Young enough to be blindly yanked around by the gaudiest fashions of the day. Too young to have the slightest sense of that, the slightest sense that if this feeling for the Hellenic world should ever be awakened, it could only express itself in a constant fight against the supposed culture of the present day. For today's gymnasium student, the Greeks themselves, as such, are dead. He likes Homer just fine, but a novel by Spielhagen is much more exciting. Yes, he is happy to gulp down the Greek tragedies and comedies, but the real modern drama, like Freytag's The Journalist, moves him in an altogether different way. He is inclined to speak of all ancient authors, just like the aesthetic Hermann Grimm, who at one point in a cultivated essay on the Venus de Milo finally muses, "What does the form of this goddess matter to me? What use to me are the thoughts it awakens in me? Orestes and Oedipus, Iphigenia and Antigone. What do they share with my heart? No, my dear gymnasium students, the Venus de Milo has nothing to do with you, and just as little to do with your teacher." Such is the sad fate of the gymnasium today. This is its secret. Who will lead you to the homeland of culture when your guides are blind and yet pose as seers? Who among you will attain a true feeling for the sacred earnest of art when you are spoiled with methods that encourage you to stutter on your own, when you should be taught to speak, to pursue the beautiful on your own, when you should be made to piously worship the artwork, to philosophize on your own, when you should be forced to listen to the great thinkers? The consequence is to keep you forever distant from antiquity, merely slaves to the present. Still, the most salutary thing about the gymnasiums as we know it today is that it takes the Greek and Latin languages seriously. For years on end, students learn respect for grammar and the dictionary, for a language fixed by rules. A mistake's a mistake. And one need not to put out at every moment by the claim that caprices and misdemeanors of grammar and spelling, like the ones we find in today's German style, can be justified. If only this respect for language were not floating in limbo, a pure rhetorical burden, as it were, from which one is immediately released on returning to the mother tongue. But the teacher of Latin or Greek typically does not bother with his native language from the start. He treats it as a place to relax after the rigorous discipline of Latin and Greek, a realm in which to indulge the lazy congeniality with which Germans tend to handle everything native to them. The splendid practice of translating from one language to another, so beneficial and stimulating an artistic sense for one's own language, is never applied with propriety and appropriate rigor and dignity to German itself, the undisciplined language where these qualities are needed most, and even these translation exercises are becoming less and less common. It is enough to understand the classical languages. One needn't bother to speak them. It is enough to understand the classical languages. One needn't bother to speak them. It is enough to understand the classical languages. One needn't bother to speak them. Here again, we see the tendency to see the gymnasium as a scholarly institution. An illuminating contrast with its former serious aspiration to provide a humanities education. It was in the age of our great poets, of the few truly cultured Germans we have ever had, that the marvelous Friedrich August Wolf channeled into the gymnasium the new classical spirit, streaming through these men from Greece and Rome. His bold beginning enabled a new image of the gymnasium, not as a sort of nursery for cultivating academic research, but as first and foremost a genuinely holy place consecrated to a higher and nobler education. Various external measures seemed necessary, and some cruel ones were successfully applied to the modern form of the gymnasium with lasting effects. But the single most important thing failed to happen. It failed to happen, consecrating the teachers themselves to this new spirit. As a result, the gymnasium's goal is now far removed from the humanities education that Wolf championed. The absolute value placed on erudition and academic education, which Wolf himself overcame, has once again, after a long and weary battle, ousted the educational principle that Wolf brought in. And erudition maintains its sole authority. If not as openly as it did before, then in disguise. Its face hidden. Moreover, what ultimately made it impossible to bring the gymnasium into the grand possession of classical education was the un-German, almost foreign, or cosmopolitan character of these educational efforts. The belief that we could pull the home soil out from under our feet and still stand firm. The insane idea that by denying the German spirit, the national spirit itself, we could leap directly into the distant Hellenic world. The truth, of course, is that one must know how to find this German spirit in its hiding places. Whether under fashionable cloaks or heaps of rubble, one must love it enough not to be ashamed of even its vestigial form. Above all, one must make sure not to confuse it with what these days goes around proudly calling itself contemporary German culture. The German spirit is, if anything, inherently opposed to such culture, and it has survived, admittedly under a rough exterior, and hardly in an impressive form, largely in domains whose lack of culture the present day likes to complain about. On the other hand, what presumes to pass for German culture today is a cosmopolitan composite, having the same relation to the German spirit as the journalist to Schiller, as Meyerbeer to Beethoven. This culture is influenced most strongly by the culture of France, a civilization un-German in its deepest, most fundamental nature, which we Germans then ape without talent and in the most dubious taste. Such imitation gives a lying, hypocritical form to German society, media, art, and stylistics. Needless to say, the copy never attains the artistic perfection that the original, a civilization emerging organically from the essence of the Roman, has continued to achieve almost up to the present. To feel the contrast, one need only compare our most prestigious German novelists with any French or Italian novelist, even the least famous ones. Both sides share the same doubtful tendencies and aims, and the same still more dubious means. But there we find artistic seriousness, correctness of language at the very least, often joined with real beauty and a harmony with corresponding social and cultural traditions throughout. Here, everything is unoriginal, flabby, unpleasantly sprawling or lolling around in shabby house clothes of thought and expression, not to mention lacking any true social background. Displays of erudition and academic mannerisms, reminding us that in Germany it is the failed academic who becomes the journalist, while in the Latin countries it is the artistic culture person. The German can never expect to prevail with this allegedly German but fundamentally derivative culture. The French and the Italian will put him to shame, and when it comes to cleverly imitating a foreign culture, so too will the Russian. All the more firmly, then, I do cling to the German spirit, as revealed to the German Reformation, and in German music, and which in the tremendous courage and rigor of German philosophy. In the recently tested loyalty of the German soldier has shown proof of that lasting strength averse to all false appearance. It is from this spirit that we too may expect to prevail over the fashionable pseudo-culture of the present day. I hope that in the future schools will draw to culture into the battle, and especially in the gymnasium, inspire the younger generations with a burning passion for what is truly German. In doing so, schools will finally put so-called classical education on its natural footing once more and give it its only possible starting point. A true purification and renewal of the gymnasium can proceed only from a deep and violent purification and renewal of the German spirit. The link between the innermost essence of the German and the genius of the Greek is a mysterious bond, extremely difficult to grasp. But until the true German spirit, in its noblest and uttermost need, reaches out for the saving hand of Greek genius, as though for a firm handhold in the raging river of barbarism, until an all-consuming desire for what is Greek breaks forth from its German spirit, until the distant views of the Greek homeland, laboriously achieved, with which Schiller and Goethe refreshed their spirits, has become a place of pilgrimage for the best and most gifted among us. Until then, the gymnasium's goal of classical education will flutter about in the air, untethered to anything. And those who work to nurture erudition in the gymnasium, however limited a form of academic spirit that might be, so as to have at least one real firm and in some sense ideal goal in view, and save their students from the seduction of the glittering phantom now called culture and education, they will have nothing to reproach themselves for. Nothing to reproach themselves for. Such is the sad state of the gymnasium, which it finds itself in today. The narrowest, most limited views are in some sense correct, because no one is capable of reaching or pointing to the place from which these views can be seen to be wrong. No one, the philosopher's friend and student asked, with no little emotion in his voice, and both men fell silent.